everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. And today's video is going to be kind of a response to something I noticed from a missionary, but the title is Did Peter from the New Testament Compose a Jewish Prayer? Now, I'm going to be honest. Um, when I noticed this video, and I kind of didn't have to go through it too much to understand where the person was coming from because I had heard this claim before. I see this as one of these things where it's like missionaries missing, kind of pulling at straws. Kind of like any little thing that they could try to try to find a way to discredit Jews in general. Many times they try to make it seem as if their arguments are against like rabbis and rabbinical authority, as they call it. But generally speaking, I see this as kind of someone who's making an attack on Jewish people as a whole. And I think it'll become clear once I kind of go through this. Now, again, I'm going to be quite honest with you that if the people who would fall for this kind of trick that the missionaries play with this kind of information are going to be really people who don't know Hebrew, who are not Jewish in most cases. And if they are a mix of people who are Jewish and not Jewish, the vast majority are going to be people who aren't Jewish, but they're going to be people who really don't know how to look up information, don't know Hebrew, for example, who have a particular agenda with the type of people you're talking about here. Because generally speaking, these are people who don't have the ability to check for themselves critically whether or not the claim that's being made is true and what it would actually mean supposedly if the claim is true. So what I want to do is I want to start in a direction that I've done in other videos, and that's with taking, this issue and kind of breaking it down. Now, just to give a backstory, the basic claim is this. There's a prayer called Nishmat Hodhai, which is a part of, modern day Jewish prayer books, for example, whether it be in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, the Sephardi or Mizrahi Jewish community, or Yemenite Jewish community. And it's essentially, it's kind of accepted to be a prayer that's, said, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, and also during like high holidays, the Hagim, also on Yom Kippur, things like that. And it has a very specific topic that it talks about in terms of the power of the creator of all things and the involvement in the creator of all things within not just the, if you will, reality, but also within the Jewish people. It focuses quite a bit on the Jewish people itself. So the basic claim that is being made by these missionaries is that Peter, one of the supposedly disciples, apostles of the New Testament, wrote this prayer. And what they try to say is that there's Jewish sources that say this. Now, at the end of the video, I'm going to go through and actually show you what Jewish sources say about this whole thing. But I want to first bring up an issue um, that I think isn't really covered, because in most cases, when you talk about Peter and Christianity, the images you see at the top of my screen are the kind of images that usually come to mind for most people. So this is going to be important when we start thinking about if this is the kind of person that supposedly represents the Peter of the New Testament, the Peter of Christianity, someone who was wearing crosses way back during the Second Temple period, someone who looked like these kind of individuals that you see here. And even if that doesn't, even if someone were to say, well, these images aren't real, they're not, actual images of the original Peter, but, they're kind of accepted to be on some level. I'm still going to say, I'm going to have to call that out, still pulling at straws, and you'll see why when I analyze and say, okay, well, let's look at things that Peter wrote, supposedly, and then say, okay, well, let's compare what he supposedly wrote, that was claimed by his, Christians that he wrote, and then look at the prayer Nishmat Hochai, and see if we can find some connection between the topics and how the information is presented in both. So let's start with looking at the New Testament and seeing the two letters that are supposedly, attributed to Peter. Now we're going to start with 1 Peter 1, chapter 1, 1 through 3. Now remember, I'm going through this in Hebrew, and I'm doing that for a very specific reason, because the prayer Nishmat Hohai is in Hebrew. So in order to kind of see whether or not we can parse from the writings of Peter something that sounds like, what is in Nishmat Hohai, we're going to have to look at this translation that goes from Greek to Hebrew of the letters of Peter, of 1 Peter, and see if we can find something in it that matches it. Okay, so be aware that again, Peter did not, as far as we know, Peter did not write anything in Hebrew that we know of. There's nothing, no text in the New Testament that we can find from the Second Temple period or after that was written in Hebrew that can be traced back to any of the original Jewish believers in Jesus, who we, as I've mentioned in other videos, disappeared within 2 generations of their start. So again, we're remembering that this text was originally written in Greek. So we're going to look at a Hebrew translation that was done modernly by Christians and see if we can find some connection. So looking at 1 Peter 1, 1 through 3, it starts out by saying, Me'eth Petros, Shilech Yeshua HaMashiach, al el hatashove tefutzot pontos. So it starts out by saying that this, supposedly letter is from. It doesn't say it was written by, but it simply says it was from Petros, which is interesting. That if this is supposedly someone who's Jewish, that he identifies himself by a name that is not even a Jewish name, Petros. Now again, you can look into Christianity about the whole thing that that's a basically a translation into Greek, of rock, and that originally he would have been called Kepha or something like that. But the idea that, he wrote about himself, calling himself Petros, specifically in Greek, says something about the idea of whoever wrote it, because there's some Christians who say that Peter didn't write these two letters, that he simply dictated it to someone else, which is fine. Um, you know, but there's some who say, okay, no, he wrote it, which again is kind of strange for someone who was living in the Galilee, who was a fisherman, who all of a sudden knew this level of Koine Greek. And again, we have no evidence that he knew Hebrew, which kind of is one of the first problems. So it continues to say, Shiliach Yeshua Mashiach. So it's saying that he's, a messenger of Jesus, essentially, who he calls Mashiach. Okay, and it says he's sending this to like the residents of a particular area of Pontos. Now again, I don't know all the history of some of these areas, but essentially he was sending letters to several different groups that is listed here, and these were like groups that, from what I understand of most Christian historians, they were not Jews. But supposedly he was presenting a theology where he was trying to present them as if they were some kind of Jews in his eyes somehow, but they weren't Jewish essentially. Okay, and then it continues, says, Al pi oto mikedem shel Elohim ha'ov. He's saying according to the knowledge or the the wisdom from beginning that belonged to Elohim the Father. So he essentially says that Elohim is the Father, Ha'av. And this is like in English people would say God. So he's essentially saying that in his mind, this in Greek I think is Deus. Is the Father, and he says "Bekudush haruach," so this seems to be kind of alluding to this idea of elements of the Trinity concept, where he says like the set apartness of the ruach, the spirit, if you will, knowing that in Greek this is probably more in line with what they were trying to get at. And it says Elisiyuth Yeshua HaMashiach Va'aziyath Domo. So essentially he's making some connection between the Jesus here, saying that Jesus Mashiach, Messiah or whatever, and the blood of like Jesus, and basically connecting it, to some concept with the Father, as he says it, the Spirit, and then mentioning Jesus, and then it kind of goes onto some other areas. I want to skip some of this here. But then he says, Baruch el Elohim avi Adonenu Yehoshua HaMashiach asher berov rachamav holid otanu mechadash letikvo hayo bit hayat Yeshua HaMashiach min hamitim. So essentially what he mentions here is he says like a blessing to Elohim, the Father, and he says like his master Adonenu, who he says is Jesus, for example. So he mentions that his master, his Adon, Adon is like saying someone who's in control of something, a master, things like that. He mentions that his Adon is Yeshua, and then he mentions that his father is Elohim, meaning that Peter is saying that he's calling, Elohim, the Father, and he's calling Jesus like by Adon, and he seems to be making some separation between Jesus and like what he calls Elohim, the Father, for example, and he mentions like something about um, this hope that they have, about I think like Jesus coming back and things like that. So that's the first place we want to start. So we want to like mention several things here. The identity of this individual, seems to be truly entrenched in Greek thought if he's calling himself Petros. So whoever he's sending it to, because again, I don't change my name for when I send letters to someone who isn't Jewish, but so be it. He also seems to be making some kind of claim towards a Trinity here, because he specifically mentions like some kind of connection between what he says Elohim Ha'av, the Kudush Haruach, then he says Letziat Yeshua Mashiach, so he seems to be connecting them somehow, but he doesn't specifically says that Yeshua, or Jesus is like Elohim. So he seems to make a distinction, but he seems to try to draw some connection between them, which some Christians have kind of said, well, this is like, proof of the Trinity, for example. He then also, mentions some kind of blessing towards the Father. He says like Avi, calling Elohim Avi, meaning like my Father. But then he mentions that Yeshua is his Adon, who's, that is their, like master, controller, or whatever it is. So let's look now next in Second Peter and see if we can find anything else that can help us in this investigation. Now, looking in 2 Peter 1, 1 through 3 also, we see that now the person who authored this one says, Me'et Shimon Petros. So this person's, whoever wrote this, or if, whether Peter wrote it or not, or he had someone write it, mentions, his name as being Shimon Petros. And of course, Petros wouldn't have been a last name according to Christian tradition, but Shimon would have been his original, name in Hebrew. And then over time, he was called Kepha, or something like that, which is Aramaic for rock. And then all of a sudden in Greek, they would have called him Petros, which is rock. So he mentions here that, the author says, whoever this Petros, this Shimon Petros is an Eved Yeshua HaMashiach Ushliho. So he says that he's a slave, or that Yeshua or Jesus like is his master, if you will, and that he's a slave to Jesus, which he says is the Mashiach, and then he says he's also his like emissary, if you will. Shilicho means like he's his emissary. So he's saying that this person who identifies themselves as Shimon Petros says he's a slave to Jesus, and he's also like an emissary for him. And he says Le'ele asher b'tzidkat Eloheinu u'Mashiach Yeshua HaMashiach. So he says basically concerning the, if you will, in English it would say the righteousness of, of his mighty one his Eloheinu. But then it says Moshiach, Yeshua Mashiach. So he specifically mentions that his Moshiach, his person who delivers him or helps him from earthly, problems, if you will, is Yeshua. He specifically identifies that. Okay, and then later on, and I'll kind of skip ahead, he mentions the same kind of thing where he says, "B'fi'atachem et Elohim Yeshua Adonenu." So again, he mentions that this Yeshua or Jesus is his Adon or his master, for example. So we find here some very specific language that can help us identify how this person writes. So he mentions Jesus quite a bit in his writings. So we would expect that anything he's going to write is going to mention Jesus as his Messiah, and that that Elohim is something else. So he mentions several times that there's Elohim is Eloheinu or Elohim as one thing, and then he mentions Jesus as something else. So once he mentions Jesus as his Messiah, and then he mentions Jesus as his Adon. So we should find something similar in this, and if this is the author of Nishmat Chochai, we should find something very similar. We should find pretty much the same thing. This should not be left out if this is something that this person wrote, for example. So let's continue and look at now Nishmat Chochai. So to begin with, we got to go through some sources here. We have to look and say, okay, well, what exactly are the sources for Nishmat Chochai? Okay, where exactly do we get information from that this is a Jewish prayer? And, its exact placement within, Jewish liturgy, if you will. So essentially, we can look, one of the first mentions of it is in the Talmud. Now, interestingly enough, the Talmud never mentions anything about the author of Nishmat Chochai being Peter. No mention of it at all. Okay, we look in the Mishnah, for example, and I'll start with the Mishnah, but because Mishnah comes first, we don't find any description of it. We look in the Mishnah Torah, we don't find a description of it. We look in, like the Talmud Yerushalayim, we don't find any mention of Peter being the author of Nishmat Chochai. We look in Rab Sa'ad Gaon, we don't find it. We look in the Moreh Nevuchim, we look at a lot of different sources, we don't find any mention of Peter being the author. So this is an important baseline to start with. If supposedly Peter was definitely the author, and this is something that all Jews agree upon, you would hope to find it somewhere in the Mishnah or the Talmud. Because around the time that supposedly Peter lived would have been prior to the Talmud and the Mishnah, for example, the compilation or the written down, information of the Mishnah and the Talmud. But to have it not mentioned in any of these primary sources is a very interesting clue. So now what we want to do is look at some of the oldest versions that we can find of Nishmat Chochai and see if we can find the same kind of wording we found in the book of Peter in this prayer. Because again, if Peter wrote this, we should find some of the same type of terminology being used. And again, we have to remember, we don't have any evidence of any of the apostles having written anything in Hebrew. So we're only trying to approximate based upon the letters of Peter that Christians accept, taking out, of course, some of the other material that they claim is claimed to be from Peter that Christians don't accept, for example. And now we want to analyze, for example, the Siddur, or the prayer book of Rav Sad Gaon, which comes from about 892 to 942 CE. That's when he lived. We want to look at his prayer book and see exactly the format of Nishmat Chochai according to him. So his version starts with Nishmat Chochai Tevorech at Shimcho Adonai Eloheinu. So it says basically, it's essentially like saying that everything that lives, that has like, a neshama, in a sense gives praises like to the name of the creator of all things. And it mentions that's Hashem, Yud He Wah He, Eloheinu. So, our Elohim. Okay, so that's pretty clear. But what you notice coming next, it never mentions anything about like anything else. So it says ruach kol basar. Now, ruach kol basar means the ruach, if you will, of the of all flesh. I mean, all like living things, if you will. So essentially, it's like saying that the creator of all things, Hashem, Yud He Wah He, is the source of all living things. That's all living things have to attribute to the creator of all things our existence. Okay, so continuing. So it says here to Hashem, to you Hashem, Yud He Wah He, essentially we can, give like it's like almost like heaping praises upon the creator of all things, and remembering, for example, that Hashem, the creator of all things, again, Yud He Wah He, is our king, always. Okay, so just in this first statement, we don't find the kind of language that we find in First and Second Peter, because he seems very clear on trying to delineate, these several different positions to, for example, in the Peter, passages of, Elohim, or in Deus as in Greek, or into this ruach, to the spirit thing, and then also delineating things to like, Jesus, for example. But we don't find that so far here. Then it continues, it says, Lador wador me'alam wa'ada olam, from generation to generations, from almost like the beginning to, forever, if you will. And this is one of the important parts here. Look in the red here. And again, Hebrews written from right to left. Ata, hu el mi be'alothecho en Elohim. This translates into you, singular, meaning Hashem, who's mentioned here. Yud He Wah He. Who, saying he is. Ata, hu, el. So it says that Hashem is El. So El is one of the terms that's used to describe the creator of all things, or something that has power. And specifically in this instance, for example, and again, I hate to use this kind of translation, but often people would translate this as being the word God. So essentially, if you were using English, and again, I'm just kind of, capitulating to the idea that some people may, have, is that it's saying that, that Hashem specifically is El. So there's no mention of anything else being along with this. And it says, Mi belotecho ein Elohim. So it's like there, beside Hashem, with Hashem, next to Hashem, there is no Elohim. There is no Elohim. So it's only Hashem. And then in the blue it says, Wa'ein lanu melech Joel u'Moshiach b'chol et sora v'suko ela oto. So this is a very key point here. And everybody who knows Hebrew knows what I'm getting at here. It says, there isn't to us a king, a deliverer, a goel, or someone who assists us, u'Moshiach, bechol et soro v'suko. Anytime we have any problems or challenges, there is no other who will be a king to us, deliver us, will provide, like earthly assistance, to us, except for you, meaning Hashem, and no one else. So what does this tell us? Remember how I mentioned earlier in the mention of First Peter and Second Peter that at one point in Second Peter, Peter says that his Moshiach is Yeshu, saying that is Jesus, for example. But here, the author of Nishmat Chochai does not make any such statement. He makes the opposite statement and says that only Hashem, Yud He Wah He, is that. Now, we've already seen here that it tells us that only Hashem is Elohim, and there is no other Elohim. Now, again, the author of Nishmat Chochai, this would be a perfect time to throw that there's other Elohims out there, or even not even to put this in here. So for example, one argument that someone may try to make is, oh, well, you just deleted it. Well, my answer to that would be, well, you show me the original. Show me the one he wrote. Where did the church fathers mention that? Because they were the earliest sources for, external to the New Testament, text, if you will, or understandings of Christian history. Nowhere in the New Testament does it mention anything about, Peter writing a prayer that was accepted by all Jews all over the world. But the statement that is used, the author of this is very specific in the language. So, if you want to say that, this was made up later, you'd almost have to delete most of the prayer. Because quite a bit of it says the same kind of thing, about only Hashem being the one who protects the Jewish people. So then the question would be, are you trying to say then that Peter only wrote this part here, Nishmat Kohai, and then everything else was written by someone else, who didn't believe in Jesus and who only believed in Hashem? Okay, well, so what? I would argue that if that's all he wrote, the part Nishmat Hochai, and then like everything else is written by somebody else, who cares? Literally it doesn't matter. But let's continue. Let's look at another Siddur. Let's say you don't want to believe that Rav Sadigal knew what he was talking about. Let's look at another early version of this particular, statement. So now we can look at the Siddur of Rav Amaram Gaon, who, we don't exactly know when he was born, but we know he died somewhere around 875 CE. So in his prayer book, he also has Nishmat Hochai, same beginning as we mentioned before. In his version, for example, we get to a certain part here where it says Min Ha'olam Ad Ha'olam Ata El. So it's basically like same thing, from the beginning, of like reality, to, basically forever. Hashem, who's mentioned here, you are El, you know, no mention of anyone else. Umi belotecha ein lanu melech goel Mashiach. So he says here, except for Hashem, we don't have another king, we don't have another goel, we don't have another Mashiach. And it says bechol et sora v'suka ein lanu ozer v'somecha ela ata v'lecha levadecha anachnu modim. So his version is a little bit different than Rav Saad Gaon's, and his version says the following here in this section here that you see my marker over. It says, for like in all times, whenever we have like, Sarah Vasuka, which is like saying challenges, troubles, different things that are like challenging our lives, whether extreme or not, or less extreme. It says, we don't have another one to help us or to, support us, if you will, except for you, meaning Hashem. And it says, V'lacha levadecha, to you and you alone, we, give praises to. Anachnu modim. So this is another version of it that is also ancient, and we see that obviously this author of Nishmat Chokai couldn't have been the Peter that we saw in First Peter and Second Peter because they don't talk anything alike. And if you go through this whole thing here, there's nothing in any of this that sounds anything like the person who wrote First and Second Peter. Because again, if you want to say, well, okay, he wrote Nishmal Hochai, but the Jewish community changed it around in order to be something different than what he wrote, then you'd have to say, well, he only wrote 3 words, and then everything else is written by someone else, which, again, at that point it doesn't matter. And I did mark this here, but if you go to the very end of this particular prayer, it actually talks about, a future Mashiach and mentions nothing in any way that's like, Jesus, and or even the way that, for example, Peter mentions Jesus, because Peter just kind of mentions, Yeshua HaMashiach. Well, this one says, David ben Yishai Avdecha Mashiach, you know, and again, you don't find any of the wording being anything like what you find in, First and Second Peter, and that's even when it's when a Christian is translating it into Hebrew. So we can even see that the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived from 1138 to 1204 CE, has a similar formulation that's used by Rav Sead de Gaon. The only difference is that in his formulation, for example, you have where it says instead of Atahu El, it says Atahu Ha El, which is very specific, like to saying that you specifically are the power. So, and again, he mentions, okay, there is no other Elohim, with, the creator of all things besides, next to or anything like that. And the same kind of thing that only the creator of all things is truly the king of the Jewish people, the Melech, the Goel Umashiach. And that's what, anytime we have troubles. So again, knowing the Christian concept, you would expect that, for example, if Peter had written this, he would insert Christian ideas about how Jesus is the one who gives him strength or forgiveness, or he would mention this idea that, the Mashiach, of his, of people would be like Jesus, like he mentions in First Peter, Second Peter. So we can tell here that the author of Nishmat Chochai does not hold by that concept. question someone may ask, okay, well, concerning did Peter write it or not, is the question might be, okay, well, where did this idea come from to begin with? Is this something that just the missionaries are making up completely, that this is an idea? So let's look at that real quick. So there's a good article that you can find called Nishmat Kol Hai. Did Peter write it? It's by Rabbi Ari Shvat. So essentially, you can read what he says here. I'll read the whole thing, just to end off this video. And essentially, or kind of end off the video. And essentially what he says is the legend of Shimon bin Kafa, Peter, as the author is just one of many possibilities raised by the Seder Avodat Yisrael, which is like a particular text, and is based upon the appearance of the backward acronym Shimon, Shochen mi Yadme, Ad Hena, Ve'ulu Feinu, and Nishmat. Rashi mentions this rumor in Machzor Vituri, page 282, and totally dismisses it, meaning that Rashi says that definitely Peter did not write this stuff, adding that anyone who says this must bring a sin sacrifice when he will go to the Beit HaMikdash. Others say that the author is the Tana, Shimon ben Shetach. The Shadal cites Rabbeinu Tam that Shimon ben Kefa authored a famous piyut for Yom Kippur, but not Nishmat Kol Hai. And remember that Rabbeinu Tam is Rashi's grandson, so that possibility is questionable for another reason. There is a legend, not found in the classic Midrashim, but from outside manuscripts that claims that Shimon ben Kaifa, Peter, purposely infiltrated the rows of early Christians and suggested that they refrain from doing the mitzvot, as it were, in order to attract other Gentiles to the new religion. But his real motive was to construct an insurmountable wedge between the Jews and Christians, so that Jews will precisely stay away from the new religion, as too reformative. This legend is also questionable, for it supposedly was Paul, who did away with the mitzvot, as opposed to Peter, who disagreed and was opposed. In any event, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Sefer Hasdim 191, cites that Shimon Kifa was righteous but others followed him wrongly. So there may be some truth to that tradition, but still no connection with the Nishmat prayer. In any event, Nishmat is a central prayer accepted by Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, and Yemenites. Its attribution to Peter is very weak, and in any event, its authorship in history is trivial and irrelevant once it was accepted. So what this means is essentially that the proof of Peter writing Nishmat Chochai is, I can say we can pretty much say that this is nonsense. And the rabbi said something, the same thing I was saying earlier, that even if you were to try to like bring that up, it's irrelevant because it doesn't even sound like anything that sounds like Christianity, if you will. You've heard the ideas in it. It doesn't sound anything like what you find in modern Christianity. So what's the relevance? None whatsoever. So essentially, I look at this again. I go back to this whole thing. When I see, missionaries bring up points like this, it's basically just pulling at straws really hard because they've got nothing else to go by. A better, position would be the things I've talked about in terms of history. So you can pretty much say that this whole thing is debunked. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.